In the beginning, the Appalachian Mountains were grander than any the continent has boasted since. So long has nature been at work on the Great Smoky Mountains that you might imagine perfection has been achieved. But perfection in nature is not to be perceived in a finished product, for none exists. The forces of change and alteration and transformation are forever at work here in the Great Smoky Mountains, as indeed within us all.
In the late 18th century, a widow woman by the name of Jane Ogle and all her children wandered into a little valley on the northern edge of a mountain range, in what was then the unsettled eastern part of an area soon to be called Tennessee. Upon arriving, she fashioned a rough house out of the abundant forest timber nearby, cleared a small plot of land to grow food for her family, and erected a barn to store the food she had grown. Being a poor woman and having recently lost her husband, Jane was looking for a place to build a new life without the encumbrances of the New World society. Upon completion of her house and barn, that was all she thought she'd achieved. Jane had no way of knowing at the time that in addition to building a new home, she had also begun building the gateway for what would be 200 years later, the most visited mountain resort area in the entire world. Jane Ogle had commenced building Gatlinburg, Tennessee, the magnificent entrance to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
I think you can sum up the history of Gatlinburg into three pivotal events that's happened over time. The first being the arrival of the widow, Martha Jane Husky, and her large family who settled there, and from that point brought other relatives to the area and settled in what an area that had been unfriendly to white settlers prior to that. And they really carved a place out of the wilderness, so to speak, in an area that had been uninhabited except for an Indian hunting ground prior to that time. And it was a very isolated area. And I think nothing describes the early days of Gatlinburg more than isolation. The folks that lived in Sevierville, the county seat, would take a day to travel up to White Oak Flats, as it was called at that time, in the original days of the settlement. And it even took a while for the Baptists to form a church in the community. So it was very slow growing. And it wasn't because the people were lazy or backward or anything like that. It was just the fact that they were isolated by the mountains from other people.
You know, this was the edge of the mountains. So there's always places that spring up at the edge of the mountains, and this was a broad little valley at the edge of wonderful timber country, and I suspect that's why Gatlinburg was established, because the people could cut timber and make money.
This is the heart of the mountains. There is little here that spells civilization. Here at the southern end of the Appalachians, a place has been set aside. Here, man and nature are not in conflict, but in harmony. This harmony of man and nature was one of the goals realized in the autumn of 1940. Then a vast tract in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina was dedicated as a national park. As President Franklin D. Roosevelt said, "To the free people of America, I dedicate this park." This is the Great Smoky Mountain National Park.
Because it actually goes way, way back to the Cherokee people who settled here over 1,000 years ago. And they actually would be the ones who gave us this name, the Smokies. But they weren't speaking in English, of course. They were saying it in their native tongue, which was the word Shekinah, which means the land of 1,000 smokes or mists. Well, they could not have picked a better name for this area. When you and I come to the Smokies, you're coming to an area that is 95% trees. And for every square mile of trees every day, there is over 1 million gallons of moisture released off of the trees. This is what causes the smoke or the mist. It's the natural water vapor coming off the trees.
The Smoky Mountains are the stories of the Eastern Cherokee whose soul has never died, and of the backcountry settlers who live on the brink of yesterday and tomorrow. The Smoky Mountains are a composition of endless themes and variations, changing with every season, with every month, in every cove and hollow, on every summit, with every pair of eyes that sees them.
But although the Smokies are only a day's drive away from 2/3 of the nation's population, nearness alone would not explain the powerful attraction that draws more than 5 million visitors to these mountains each year. Certainly, Great Smoky Mountains National Park must have a wide range of attractions and facilities to draw such a large number of visitors. Just what is it they find here?
Several generations passed, and as a new generation would come, they would settle out on land grants a little further from where Martha Jane had settled there in White Oak Flats and Cartertown and Sugarlands, and different communities grew up around that nucleus of the Ogle family right there in Gatlinburg, or White Oak Flats as it was called at that time. And that's the way it remained until the 1850s, when a gentleman named Radford Gatlin came and really stirred up the pot. I find it amusing that the man for whom the town was eventually named was probably the biggest scoundrel that ever lived in the area. He was at least the most unpopular man that ever lived in the town. I can say that for sure. And the story of how the town received the name of Gatlinburg goes back to the fact that Radford Gatlin had built a general store, and it was in competition to the Ogle store that was in town.
And Radford C. Gatlin was a preacher. Of course, in those days, that didn't require going to formal seminary, and he had very much antagonized a lot of people in the Paw Paw Holler area, and even among his own congregation. So it was said he was kicked out of the church, but he had a land grant, a soldier's land grant in this area. When he came to town, he also brought with him a black slave, which was, at the time, very unpopular, especially in this immediate area of White Oak Flats, because the vast majority of the people here did not support slavery. Well, he comes here and he opens up the second general store in town, and he and the Ogles have a lot of disagreements. Again, he was disliked, and in 1860, he decides he's going to talk to the postmaster at the time of White Oak Flats, and he's going to offer Mr. Reagan a portion of his little general store to be used as the post office, or the little postal station, as they were called back then. And Radford Gatlin's very shrewd. He knows Tennessee postal laws at the time that say wherever the station is, you take the name of the shop owner, or the owner of the inn, the building, the store. And so the mail originally is going to have to come to Gatlin's store because the little postal station is in his store. And so, being one of the few Germans in the area, Radford Gatlin says, why don't we use the term Burg, since that means town or village in German. So for a short time it was 2 words, Gatlinsburg, because this is where our post office was. And in no time at all, it became 1 word, Gatlinburg.
Things settled down after Gatlin left and the Civil War ended. Very little action during the Civil War, even though it was a very hard time for the people up there because of the isolation and the lack of food, and all the men folk were away from home. It was a very hard time. And there was a little skirmish called the Battle of Burg Hill that took place when the Thomas Legion was encamped there in Gatlinburg for a little while, but nothing major in that as far as that goes. But as the years passed, Reconstruction was hardly even known in Gatlinburg. There just wasn't that much reconstruction to be done. They had not lost anything as far as buildings go from armies and that sort of thing. So they just went back to their farms. And then there was this vigilante group that was formed in Sevier County called the Whitecaps. And even though they reigned terror throughout the county, there was very little action with the Whitecaps in Gatlinburg as well. Again, I think isolation played a part into that.
The miracle is that we in our progress through life can join with the mountains in theirs and flow for a time together toward whatever destination lies at the end of our course. Welcome to the Great Smoky Mountains. And on behalf of a lot of fine people, welcome to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Hi, I'm John DeRees, and I hope you enjoy your visit with us here in one of America's favorite vacation destinations. Leave your car at your lodgings and let our trolleys take you around. Whatever your pleasure in family entertainment, it's here, beautifully situated in Gatlinburg and the Great Smoky Mountains.
The movement just swelled, and then when FDR came in 33, and they were looking for public works projects, they refocused on things like this. They announced the park not long after FDR came in. It took years for it to be developed, and then they had a big dedication when Roosevelt himself came to dedicate the park. Oh, I think a lot of the good things in Gatlinburg go back to Pi Beta Phi, because this was an extremely isolated area. You had rail lines into the park to get the timber out. There was no good transportation here. This was just a very isolated little area, just like you see in eastern Kentucky and north of Georgia and all that. What made Gatlinburg different? Why did Gatlinburg end up the way it did? There's a lot of answers to that question, but Pi Beta Phi and Aramont and people like Andy Huff are part of the answer to that. People had some education, they had vision, they saw opportunity.
In 1912, a fraternity from up north who was interested in teaching mountain children decided to buy some property and establish a mission there at Gatlinburg, the Pi Beta Phi fraternity, and that's always been something very odd to me. It was what I would call a sorority because it was a ladies group, but it's called a fraternity. And they established Pi Beta Phi settlement school there. And it was very instrumental in educating the people of the area. They had a place to go to school. There'd been no county schools in the area up until that time. But they struggled. They weren't very well accepted in the beginning, and they were just ready to pull out and leave. Things were just not going well. And a prominent citizen by the name of Andy Huff, who operated a sawmill out of town up toward Greenbrier, had left his wife and children there in town, and the children had started going to school. And when Mrs. Huff got wind of the fact that school might be closing, she had a vision. And she envisioned that ignorance would just take over her family, so to speak. And the next day she got word up to her husband, Andy Huff, that he had to come and do something to save that school for her children. She didn't want her children and her friends and neighbors to grow up in ignorance with no opportunity of an education. Well, she saved the day for the school. From that, Andy Huff went out to some other prominent people in the area, the Whaley, Steve Whaley, and several other people. And keep in mind, this was before Gatlinburg became a tourist town, and there wasn't a lot of money. But some people like Andy Huff, who had made some money in the lumber business, and Steve Whaley and others were able to make enough money till they could come up with something in order to save the school, and they did.
But being here and knowing what the conditions were for the mountain people, they had no income. And when the Pi Phis came, that school came, they came in 1912, and they taught, a lot of the mountain people, like women already knew how to weave, of course, but they taught them new patterns and new things. And the men they took up the weaving of the baskets or making furniture. But the difference was they had a market for it, through the Pi Phis. So for the first time, the mountain people had an income. See, before they couldn't. And I remember my husband said while they were here, and I relayed the message to them, that he felt that the coming of the Pi Phis was more important to this area than the establishment of the park. Because of what I've just said, it gave the people an opportunity to be able to make money, to turn that effort over and get an income from it.
Not only did the Pi Phis provide education for the local mountain folks, they also saw a need for medical attention as well. And if a doctor was called on, they had to come by horseback from Sevierville at that time. So some nurses were sent to the area, and they were not well received at first because mountain folk did not take well to outsiders, even if it was a nurse trying to save their life. But eventually some of the nurses that came to Pi Phi were able to gain the confidence of the local people, and they helped fight epidemics. There were a couple of them that was around during the flu epidemic of 1918 that were very instrumental in saving lives and providing medical care and teaching basic health and well-being to the mountain folks. So it was a very pivotal thing, that was part of the overall education that they provided, the book learning as well as how to take care of yourself. And there were instances where these nurses would go out and where a family just kept being sick, and then they would discover that the reason they were being sick, they were getting their drinking water just a little bit below where they had their outdoor toilet, and things like that were done out of just lack of education. So it all worked together to make for a better living environment.
It was 5 families, the Ogles and Huffs and Whaleys and Reagans and Maples. And I'd say that I feel like that the persons who owned the most land was Squire Maples and E.E. Ogle, who was my husband's grandfather, and he had the country store, but he was already gone when I came here. His son Charlie ran the store.
The boom in Gatlinburg happened after the park was announced and while they were working on it. Steve Whaley built his hotel. The Huffs had the Mountain View already. Rail built this. I think it had 12 rooms and was called Maples Manor, and he realized pretty quick that he needed a bigger hotel. This was where the Maples home place was, on this property here. They owned the property.
Rail's mother and daddy lived in a little white frame house where the ticket agent is for the sky lift, and the hotel set back here. And as I remember that it was physically, size-wise, the same. But now, through the years, and that was after when Real married, they did some, if you can look at the pictures down the wall, they did some outside work that put the balconies on and some extra things that made it look like it does now. I heard him tell that he took a scoop with a mule to dig out the foundation and the site for the hotel. When it was no mechanized machinery to help.
The Maples family was kin to the frontiersman, Davy Crockett, the original Davy Crockett, who grew up about 60 miles north of Gatlinburg on the Nolichucky. And when you come into Gatlinburg today, the land that sits right behind the Gatlinburg Inn, if you look off to the highest ridge that would be behind the inn, that is still Crockett's Ridge today. And that land was all owned by the Maples family. And so how they're kin, from what the genealogies and the family records and histories show us the best that we can understand, Davy Crockett Maples Sr., okay, his grandmother was the sister to Davy Crockett.
Once that park was established, then everything changed in Gatlinburg, and the Gatlinburg that we know today developed from that. And Rel Maples is one of the original hotel owners there. He built the Gatlinburg Inn in 1937. Now, he built that on what had been his family's corn patch. And he knew that the new road was going to be built right in front of it, and it all happened just about the same time. And he, like Steve Whaley and Andy Huff, served 3 hot meals a day, the hotel, and they were renowned for their food and their hospitality, their mountain hospitality. And these hotel owners did not hire outsiders to work. They worked hard. They worked alongside of the few hired hands that they had to establish a business. If you walk in the Gatlinburg Inn today, which is the only survivor of the original 4 hotels that I mentioned, you'll see photographs hanging on the wall of their proud heritage. There's a huge painting of Crockett Maples, who is a legendary figure in the lore of Smoky Mountains, and he was actually the grandfather of Rel Maples. And he was on a trip across the Smoky Mountains just to help out a man that he didn't even know find his way over to Cherokee, and was caught in a blinding snowstorm. And he went snowblind and was unable to make it back throughout the night, and he crawled in a log to protect himself from the snow, but his legs were hanging outside the log and were frostbitten. Well, when he managed to make his way to the nearest cabin the next day, it was obvious that his legs were frostbitten and were going to have to be amputated. So there was a crude surgery done with using only moonshine for anesthesia there in the shed behind the house, and both of his legs were amputated, and there's very little hope for his survival. But he did live 45 more years after that. Now, when Crockett Maples got well enough, he cut his own wood and built him a set of legs, and he learned to walk quite well with those. And eventually his first wife died, leaving him with a large family of around 10 children, I think it was. He married a younger woman and had another set of children about the same size. So he lived quite a long life like that. He became a mail carrier, as did his son, Crockett Jr., and it was from those 2 Crocketts that Rel Maples is descended.
If you start with the very, very first maple coming into this area that there's record of, was William A. Maple, who had the store out at Banner. Okay, first one here. His son, David Crockett Maple Sr., okay, he has two sons, David Crockett Maple Jr. and Isaac Maple, okay? And Isaac Maple is the father to Hattie Maple. And David Crockett Maple Sr. is the grandpa to Rel Maples. Rel Maples' father was David Maples Jr.
Well, Rel was a different kind of person, I guess. Maybe that's not the way I should say it, but he is different than a lot of people that I knew growing up. He was a businessman and knew how to do things that had to be done.
Rel was good to Wilma. He was good to us, and he had a personality that wouldn't quit.
And Mr. Maple, see, that's all I could call him because I didn't know him except as a boss. In a time or two, he brought the ones who worked here and took me and the girl who lived with me over there out to dinner, but I didn't think anything about that. And there was never any indication that he never showed any interest. But I got a letter from him out of a clear sky asking me to marry him. Well, I cried for 3 months because I didn't know him. He was older than me. He was 48 years older. He had a living ex-wife. He had 2 grown boys. And I was an old 30-year-old old maid. But I did an awful lot of praying about it. And it was a wonderful marriage. We were married 31 and a half years. And it was a wonderful marriage.
You see images of celebrities that have visited Gatlinburg and stayed at the inn over the years. Tennessee Ernie Ford, Liberace, Lady Bird Johnson, and others who have stayed there at different times. So if there's any place in Gatlinburg that you can sort of step back into time, it's the Gatlinburg Inn. And perhaps one of the most intriguing stories to locals is the fact that one of our state songs was written there in room 388 of the Hotel Rocky Top back in the 1970s, I think it was.
Boudleaux and Felice Bryant were wonderful people. They were songwriters, a husband and wife songwriting team that lived in Nashville. They and a lot of the Nashville musicians loved to come to Gatlinburg. You have to remember there wasn't good airplane service out of Berryfield in Nashville then. There weren't many places to go. These were the closest mountains, and people would come up here with regularity from Nashville. We had people here, as we mentioned, Carl Smith, June Carter. We had Brenda Lee, Roy Acuff, Tennessee Ernie Ford, Ferlin Husky, Webb Pierce. Webb Pierce would pull in that big Bonneville convertible he had with the silver dollars and park in the parking lot and word, yeah, Webb Pierce is at the Gatlinburg Inn, you know. Webb Pierce is big at one point in time. He and Carl Smith were basically the successors to Hank Williams in the 1950s. They loved coming up here. I remember meeting them up here when I was 10, 12 years old. They drove a Mercedes. Nobody else drove a Mercedes then. Of course, they could afford to because they had written most of the Everly Brothers hits. So many big songs. Love Hurts, All I Have to Do Is Dream. Very nice people. Wilma and Rel really liked them. In August of 1967, the Bryants came up and they were given room 388. They'd come up here and write songs and relax and enjoy each other, and they were working on a project for Archie Campbell.
And I said to Boudleaux, I said, I'm sick of this. I'm getting arthritic. I said, I think I'm growing gray hairs on this project. I said, let's write something happy up. And Boudleaux always believed in, he had tunnel vision. Zero in on a thing, get that target the heck out of the way and get on with it. Well, as you can tell interviewing me, that I scatter in a hurry. And so I'm scattering real big here. And I said, no, I can't do another thing on this Golden Years project. I need something up and happy. And so he knew that when I was hit with a case of the dumps, he couldn't cut through it, so he went along with it. And he started it. He even titled it. And in about 10 minutes, we were through with it. And he says, now can we get on with the rest of this job? And then he proceeds to forget all about it. But I had high hopes for it. Intuition, I guess. Sonny and Bobby Osborne called up and said, we have a session coming up. And I said, do you have anything for us? And Boudleaux, the salesman, never said no, because he could write to order in a second. And he said, yeah, I got something for you. Let's look it over. Come on over. And so when he hangs up, he says, honey, do we have anything for the Osborne brothers? I said, how about that little bluegrass thing that we did over in Gatlinburg? He says, what bluegrass thing? I said, you know that, he says, well, what's the name of it? Well, hell, I couldn't think of the name of it either. But I knew where it was. I said, I'll go get it. So he looks at it and he refreshes himself, because he'd put his lead notes down, and he'd refresh himself on how it went. And then Sonny's at the door. And so he shows it to Sonny, and Sonny hears the wish that I was on old Rocky Top down in that. He hears that part. He says, oh, that's great, okay. He says, I'll send Bobby over for the chords. Bobby learned to do the chords with the number thing that they're doing now. And I'm sitting there in the kitchen, and I said to Sonny, I says, hey, wait a minute. He's accepted a song that he hasn't heard all of. I says, wait a minute, he isn't finished yet. Oh, well, he can write the rest of it before Bobby gets here.
I still remember meeting Felice and Boudleaux Bryant about the time they wrote Rocky Top in room 388. And they treated this place as a home away from home. Wilma and Rel would let them stay in 388 even when the hotel was closed during the winter. And it was a real testimony to their friendship that when they were inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, they took one guest, Wilma Maples.
Like they're all the same furniture. I can see Boudleaux sitting here strumming his guitar, and she and Felice over there, or he, one on one sofa and one on the other. And you know, that's where they did, I'm sure that's where they did the work. She could confirm that, but I'm sure that's right. If we knew they were coming, we saved this room for them. They knew that.
First he saw that there was going to be a tremendous tourist attraction, and he built a hotel, and then as the park got developed, he kept adding on to the hotel. The place very quickly expanded when the park fully opened, and then around 1960 or 61, I think, he fully remodeled the place in a way that might have been deemed risky at the time. Put a lot of money into really modernizing it, but it was a great thing for the hotel, and the hotel we have today is essentially the hotel that it was remade into at that time.
My Uncle Rail was, he smoked cigars and wore a hat, and he was a larger-than-life character, and he loved children. Our side of the family never really knew Rail's side of the family, and we loved the inn because, like I said, we got to come up here, and Rail was just a great uncle. Loved him like I loved Aunt Wilma, even though he wasn't blood kin to me, just a great man. And so we had a great love for the inn as well as their side. And when Wilma passed, this thing was in a trust to be sold. I don't know if you know that story or not. It had to be sold, and the proceeds were going to be divided amongst the families. And their side did not. David originally went to represent our side of the family to get the trust closed. And he and I had some conversations about like to keep the thing, and so we were kind of set out to maybe buy the other side out if they wanted to sell, and they were doing the same thing. And we kind of got to know each other. Luckily, the trust didn't close for over a year, so we got to know each other, and really got to like each other. And they called us one day out of the blue, wanted to know if we wanted to buy this thing together from the trust instead of selling it, and that way we could preserve it. We both had a love for it. So we got together and we bought the thing. The families bought the thing from the trust and set out to preserve it and make it a profitable bit. It was a labor of love for both of us. None of us are going to get rich with it, but it's a labor of love for both sides of the family. And Bill Maples and Jack Maples, who are on the board with Dave and I, they're like brothers to us now. You know, we just love them. So
it took some time to get where we are. Mm-hmm. You know, we didn't. The two families didn't really know one another.
No.
You know, we didn't grow up together. There was really distance until after she passed away, and we got to know Alan and David, and
right.
The relationship grew, and once we finally realized the direction we were going, it just clicked. It really did.
When we became part owners, we realized that we had a real legacy to preserve. She was a capital P preservationist, and sometimes that's not fully compatible with running a commercial enterprise. So one of the challenges of ownership of this place is to maintain that sense of history and what made Gatlinburg what it is, while still making it a business that can sustain itself and make customers happy and keep them coming back, while at the same time making them appreciate what Gatlinburg has been through the years and still can be. You know, my brother likes to say that we're the oldest rat in the crib, and we have to stand for something. You know, the Gatlinburg Inn stands for the fundamental values that made this town, and I hope it always will.
And I guess for people being here, I want it to be a second home for them. I want it to be what it is still for me, a place I can come and I can go home and just kind of let my hair down here and go home and pick the things up that I have to deal with every single day. And she's left us a legacy which we hope we can carry on with this hotel. That people come here and we treat them as family and love on them. And say, hello, how are you? Are you having a good time here? Yeah. What can I do to help you? Is there anything you need?
After they went through the process of the Millers and the Maples getting together, they've done a lot of work on this hotel and put it up to standards more than it was before. But you know, when it was built in 1937, there's a lot of history to this hotel that now I hate to see disappear, which would have happened if it hadn't been put together after Wilma died. He told us that at your age, said I'd just sell it and get out and enjoy the money for however many years you got left. And we started home. And I told him, I said, he don't understand how we operate. So I told her, I said, we never have operated that way, and I don't think we ought to start. If there's any way we can take our part and help put this back together, then we need to do that. So that's what we did.
And it's just kind of interesting what happened. Actually, we had heard, through our connections in the hotel industry, there was actually a pretty big hotelier out of the Knoxville area that was looking at the property. And actually, I believe, talking with the estate and with the ownership about trying to buy the property. But we knew what his intentions were to knock the hotel down and come back and build a new hotel and, some additional retail, and obviously obviously try to do something profitable for him, you know, based on what he had to pay for the property, which was a worry to me because I thought, and I think a lot of people in Gatlinburg thought that losing the Gatlinburg Inn would be, you know, just a terrible thing. And you know, we'd already lost the Mountain View, which was another historic hotel, and that was obviously a big tragedy in Gatlinburg. And certainly I think losing the Gatlinburg Inn would have been another one. And not just because it was an old hotel, it's got so much character, so much history here. It's not just an average hotel sitting on the side of the road that's been here for 75 years. It is a, you know, architecturally it's very unique, historically, and the things that have happened here, and obviously the people that have stayed here, songs that have been written here. It was, you know, it would be awful if Gatlinburg lost this property.
The place reflects the character of the place around it, of the Smokies and its people. You know, natural materials, natural surroundings. We've got local staff that really, you know, buy into the place. They feel, I think, a sense of ownership of it. And I think people in Gatlinburg generally feel a link to the place because it does represent the beginnings of Gatlinburg as a great tourist attraction.
We have every guest registration book except the very first one from 1937 to 1939. We have the names, and we have when they stayed here and the room number. We don't have addresses, so you have to have a pretty good working knowledge of history to be able to recognize names, and sometimes you have to deduce who people are or research and say, was it really them? You know, Herbert Hoover stayed here. I think that was President Hoover, but you know, we're not certain. But we have, starting in the 30s, Duncan Hines. You know, most people think Duncan Hines is a cake mix, but they don't know the real story. He had adventures in good eating and these books he wrote, and they were guides for people traveling, and he gave this place a great review in 1940. It's mentioned in his book. You know, Kurt Vonnegut stayed here at the end of World War II. He was living in Knoxville. He was in the military. Those of you who don't know, he wrote Slaughterhouse-Five, and a great author. Coming on up, Carl Smith and June Carter spent their honeymoon here. Now, June Carter was later married to Johnny Cash, but Carl Smith was Carlene's father. Liberace. Liberace played out at the theater in the late 50s. I think tickets were $3 and $5 to see him. Aunt Wilma said he was the nicest man that ever stayed here. The only other person that she just loved as much as Liberace was Pistol Pete Maravich. Aunt Wilma loved him, said he was just a wonderful fellow, and it broke her heart when he died. National Governors Conference in '51 was in Gatlinburg. That's not the Southern Governors Conference. That's not the Republican Governors Conference. That's the National Governors Conference. You had people that, they didn't all stay here. They stayed at the Mountain View and the other place in town, a couple of other places, I think. I think we had 11 governors under roof here, including Earl Warren, who was later Chief Justice of the United States, Governor Weatherby from Kentucky, Herman Talmadge from Georgia, who served years in the Senate. It was a big deal.
We have put a lot of money in this place over the last 4 years to upgrade it, bring it modern, but keep the feel of the place same. And we want it to be a destination for families to come to the Smokies and come to Gatlinburg and have a family vacation and meet and enjoy themselves. And if you talk to any of the staff, the staff here is just great. We're so lucky to have what staff we have, and they're like family with us. Miss Bunny and Glenda behind the desk, and Peggy and Ann that do the breakfast. They take pride in what they're doing because a lot of them love this place too. They'll tell you they love this place. It's a unique place. It really is in our minds anyway. So
I think the hotel will only get better.
Yeah.
Yeah. There'll be ongoing things that'll, that'll need to be done. But I think all in all, we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. I think the growth, the next generation that will be customers here, I think we've created a totally different dynamic that was here before.
When we talk about the historic Gatlinburg Inn, we take great pride and have enjoyed being a part of this transition. You know, when you look at the beginning of our contract with the Gatlinburg Inn, the TripAdvisor ratings were in the 30s, and now it's usually top 5 when you look at the 90 hotels in Gatlinburg. At the very beginning, the hotel did not perform that great in revenues, but today it's one of the top producers.
You know, in a way, it was kind of like a big bed and breakfast. They lived here, and they had guests. And it's, you know, we still want to have that kind of sense that when you come to stay at the Gatlinburg Inn, you're a guest of these families, of the Miller family and the Maples family, and we want you to be treated like Rel and Wilma treated their guests when they were here.
The atmosphere, we have wonderful, wonderful help here. They all take pride in their work. We've tried to preserve so much of what we had, and the best of it, you know, this is one place where, how many hotels do you know where you get to know other guests? People make friends here. People meet people, and they intentionally come back the same time every year. There's groups that do that, and they just met here at the inn. And that's the thing about the fire that we had last fall of 2016. You know, if this hotel had burned, and by the grace of God and the Gatlinburg Fire Department, it did not, and we'll be always appreciative of both. This was the one thing in Gatlinburg that if it was destroyed, it could be rebuilt, but it could never be replaced because of the history and the architecture and the tradition here.
It burned a warehouse right across the street from this hotel, and so it got closed. Then we came up here on Thursday before they opened it, let it open back up on Friday. And the swimming pool it looked like it was that deep of cinders and ashes and everything in it, so it got pretty hot around here.
If you look at the magnitude of what happened here and the decisions they made in a short period of time to save lives and save downtown Gatlinburg, I think they did about as good as you could do, you know.
I have mentioned that the pioneer spirit has prevailed in Gatlinburg since the very beginning, and only recently in 2016 when the wildfires occurred in Gatlinburg, once again there was huge losses, and a lot of people suffered and a lot of people lost what they owned, and it was amazing how the community came together, much as they had done in earlier times of history when different things had happened. Once again, they had a tragedy that pulled them all together, and miraculously, the whole town was not lost. It was close. It was very close, and some of the people that witnessed that firsthand are amazed that anything survived. But I think the lesson learned from all of that, and from my perspective, is the fact that that pioneer spirit still prevails in the mountain folks. And they're not all native mountain folks, but once they get here, they become part of that.
Because there was something about living in these mountains. It made you strong, and it drew you close to God. These people had a strong, strong faith. And it was tested many, many times. But it came back that night of November 28th. This inn today, where it sits, is a bastion of the best of Gatlinburg and the best of its people. And it's a testimony to their values that it still continues today.
Within the last 30 years, it's been unreal with the motels and hotels that's built here. This just happened to be the oldest of the one that's left.
So when you think about history, people who enjoy and appreciate history, they come into this hotel and when you walk down the Hall of Fame, which when you come into the lobby here, you see pictures of signed autographed pictures of Liberace, of late Lady Bird Johnson. It's just a list that goes on and on. Then when you speak more to the history of Rocky Top being written in room 388 in 1967, the first bank in Gatlinburg was in these walls. The first Chamber of Commerce was started here at the Gatlinburg Inn. And so when you think about those things, it's something that is unique to Gatlinburg. This hotel was built in 1937. That's a long time ago, but as we go through and we renovate this hotel, we keep that in mind. So when you walk into the lobby and you see things that are new, but they look like that they belong back in 1937. That has been a challenge at times, but it's been of importance to keep everything the way that it should be.
It's been challenging. We've had some tough decisions to make, but it's difficult to take an old building and try to modernize it and still keep it an old building. It's people like the Creature Conference, and but we've done okay.
Very proud. I think we saved it. It would not be here today.
Yeah, had these two families not come together, it would be
right.
It wouldn't be here.
There are places in Gatlinburg and the Smoky Mountains where you really understand what the historical culture of Appalachia is all about. And that's one reason I'm so proud we're able to maintain the Gatlinburg Inn, because it really is the largest relic of what Gatlinburg was. And I think that people in Gatlinburg are happy that we were able to keep the inn. But
it would be. I just hope people find it welcoming. It's important to us that you feel welcome and that you want to come back. And we're trying to make improvements in a good way, and we're open to suggestions. Just want you to feel at home, and anything we can do to help and make your stay better, we want to.
And it's important to preserve places like the Gatlinburg Inn as living evidence of why this is a special place, and to maintain Gatlinburg as the key gateway to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Continue to preserve it for the future. We've even, there's talks about trying to revitalize the restaurant. There's talks about the John Sevier room. How can we revitalize that space and use it for the future? So there's still opportunities for the inn for the futures that I hope that we'll continue to try to bring to the forefront.
We're going to try to make this hotel always make it better, but always preserve the best of it. Give people enough where they can do something, but don't give them so much where they don't want to do anything. That's basically what Wilma and Rail did with us in this inn. They gave us something that we could do something with, and that's what we're trying to do.